On June 22, 1941, when Nazi Germany launched its invasion of the Soviet Union, one of the most brutal and ruthless campaigns in modern history began. In defense of their homeland, over 800,000 Soviet women took up arms and joined the fight. Lethal snipers, brave pilots, dedicated nurses, and daring partisans, these women not only faced the dangers of the battlefield, but also the cruelest fate when captured by the enemy. In the hands of their captors, these heroines endured unimaginable horrors: relentless torture, humiliation, forced labor, and summary executions. Of the thousands captured, only a few survived to tell their story. What atrocities did these warrior women endure? How did they confront the systematic abuse and brutality of their tormentors? Join us as we uncover the dark and tragic fate of those who dared to challenge the enemy. Welcome to Wartime Archive. The mobilization of women in the Red Army, response to the Nazi invasion. At dawn on June 22, 1941, Operation Barbarossa unleashed one of the most ruthless campaigns of World War II. The Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union brought unprecedented brutality and a radical shift in the scale of the conflict. The Eastern Front, the scene of the war's bloodiest battles, forced the Soviet Union into massive mobilization, where every available resource was crucial for survival. In this desperate context, over 800,000 women answered the call of their homeland, joining the ranks of the Red Army in roles that far exceeded traditional expectations. Until then, women's participation in warfare had largely been confined to support tasks. However, Soviet ideology, which championed gender equality within the communist framework, and the urgent need for defense on the Eastern Front, opened the door for thousands of women to take on active combat roles. It was not an invitation, but a demand. The nation required every available hand to halt the Nazi advance. The Red Army needed not only soldiers but individuals capable of engaging in modern warfare, where air superiority, sniper precision, and guerrilla tactics would be decisive. Under the pressure of invasion, women of all ages were recruited and trained in record time. While many took on roles in nursing and logistics, a considerable number excelled in direct combat. Soviet propaganda leveraged their sacrifices to glorify the image of women as heroines and symbols of national resistance. However, beyond the posters and speeches, these women faced not only the violence of the enemy, but also prejudice and discomfort within their own ranks. Commanders accustomed to leading male units doubted their abilities, and the extreme conditions of the front only exacerbated their struggles. For these combatants, the war was not only a battle against the Nazi invasion, but also an opportunity to prove their worth and break the barriers that limited them. Yet, while some achieved glory, others were entirely forgotten once the conflict ended. One example of recognized heroism is Lyudmila Pavlichenko, who became one of the deadliest snipers of the war, with 309 confirmed kills. Pavlichenko was celebrated as a living legend, decorated and internationally recognized for her bravery and precision. Not all were as fortunate. Maria Vasilyevna Smirnova, a combat pilot who completed over 100 aerial missions, returned to a society that no longer needed her. Her service, though equally courageous, went unacknowledged, and she spent her final days in obscurity and poverty. Yevdokia Zavali, the only woman to command a Marine infantry platoon, faced a similar fate. Despite demonstrating exceptional leadership in the conflict's harshest battles, her contributions were quickly forgotten. "They needed us during the war, but after the victory, we were no longer necessary," she admitted in a 1965 interview. Nina Petrova, another notable figure, was a veteran sniper who trained hundreds of soldiers. Despite her skill and dedication, she died in an accident shortly after the war, receiving neither the honors nor recognition she deserved. Her story symbolizes the neglect and oblivion many female veterans faced after the conflict. Women's participation in the Red Army was vital to Soviet defense, but their struggles did not end with the war. While a few were celebrated as heroines, Most of these women, who sacrificed as much as their male counterparts, returned to lives overshadowed by neglect and indifference. Their contributions were fundamental, yet their stories still await full acknowledgement. Between life and death, women at war. When the Nazi army began its relentless advance toward the heart of the Soviet Union, the country faced a brutal reality. Survival required every available human resource. The mobilization of women was not a decision driven solely by ideology, but a desperate necessity at a time when the nation's fate hung by a thread. Thus, thousands of Soviet women joined the Red Army, an unprecedented event for a power of such magnitude and a clear symbol of the war's devastating impact. However, this revolutionary measure brought challenges both on the battlefield and within society. From the first clashes, the brutality of war became evident. The Nazi army, with its military might of tanks, bombings, and coordinated tactics, left no room for mercy. For newly mobilized women, the battlefield became a place of constant terror. Fear, cold, and death were their daily companions. Yet retreat was not an option. These women fought not only for their country, but to prove they could be as brave and effective as any male soldier in an environment that viewed them with skepticism. Among the most notable units of this period were the snipers. Initially, commanders doubted their abilities, but the women demonstrated exceptional skill and precision. Trained in the use of precision rifles, they stealthily infiltrated enemy lines, eliminating key targets such as Nazi officers. Records show that some accumulated hundreds of confirmed kills, surpassing even their male counterparts. For these snipers, combat was a test of patience, stealth, and lethality. Their success on the battlefield earned them the respect of their comrades and turned them into figures of inspiration on the Eastern Front. Aviation was another area where Soviet women made historic contributions. Perhaps the most famous example is the Night Witches, a unit of female pilots who carried out nocturnal bombing missions. They flew old wooden and canvas biplanes, fragile and vulnerable to enemy fire. Yet these aircraft, which made barely a sound while gliding, became the terror of German troops. The Witches displayed unparalleled bravery, embarking on near-suicidal flights, evading enemy fighters and anti-aircraft fire under extreme conditions. Despite the hardships, they made a significant strategic impact on the war's outcome. While snipers and aviators received some recognition for their achievements, many women were assigned more traditional roles, such as nurses and combat medics. These women, though unarmed, experienced the horrors of war on the front lines. Their mission was to save lives under nearly impossible conditions, constant enemy fire, limited resources, and no time for rest. Many died trying to rescue wounded soldiers, becoming silent heroes whose work was essential but rarely acknowledged with the same fervor as that of combatants. Throughout the war, these women displayed extraordinary physical and mental resilience. Whether as snipers, pilots, nurses, or partisans, their presence on the front lines broke paradigms and redefined the role of women in times of war. However, their struggle did not end with the conflict. Returning to a society that still saw them as anomalies was another challenge many faced with the same courage with which they had fought the enemy. On the battlefield, Soviet women faced not only death, but also the burden of a world that still questioned their place in history. Surviving the horror, trauma, hunger, and -30-degree cold. Life on the front lines for women in the Red Army during World War II was a brutal ordeal that tested not only their physical endurance, but also their psychological strength. As the Nazi invasion advanced and the war intensified, these women faced not only the enemy, but also extreme conditions that turned mere survival into a daily battle. Extreme cold was one of their worst enemies. During the harsh Soviet winters, temperatures dropped to deadly levels, reaching below -30 degrees Celsius. Female combatants, often without adequate gear, battled hypothermia while performing their duties in trenches and makeshift shelters. Resources were scarce, with priority always given to weaponry, and the army's immediate needs. During the winters of 1941 and 1942, an estimated 20% of Soviet troops, including women, suffered severe frostbite, losing fingers and toes, and in many cases, succumbing to untreated infections that turned fatal. Food was another insurmountable challenge. Daily rations for Soviet soldiers, especially during critical offensives like the Battle of Stalingrad, were grossly insufficient. At the most desperate times, troops survived on just 500 grams of bread and thin soup, a caloric intake far below what was necessary for active combatants. Many women resorted to gathering wild herbs or hunting small animals to supplement their meager rations, yet malnutrition was inevitable. Constant hunger weakened their bodies, affecting their energy and stamina on the battlefield. The lack of hygiene and medical care was equally devastating. Women faced the same unsanitary conditions as men, compounded by the absence of proper sanitary supplies for their specific needs. Gynecological infections and gastrointestinal illnesses caused by contaminated water and poor hygiene were rampant. It is estimated that up to 30% of soldiers suffered health conditions including pneumonia and dysentery, which spread uncontrollably through the ranks. However, the most harrowing burden for many combatants was the psychological toll they endured. The Red Army did not tolerate vulnerability, expecting the same level of resilience from women as from men. Any sign of weakness was perceived as a lack of commitment to the cause. As a result, women often concealed their suffering, further exacerbating the emotional impact of the war. Many developed what is now recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, although it was not formally acknowledged at the time. Accounts from female combatants like Zoya Kroll, a nurse who served in Stalingrad, reflect the accumulated trauma. In one of her letters, Zoya described losing the ability to sleep due to the persistent images of the wounded and dying she tended. The cries of the wounded haunted me. Even when I closed my eyes, I could still see them. Sometimes I wished it was me who had fallen, just to stop hearing those screams. Stories like hers reveal the silent emotional burden many women carried without recognition or help. War hysteria was another common manifestation of trauma. Some women experienced panic attacks, uncontrollable crying, or temporary paralysis as a result of the relentless terror and exhaustion. It is estimated that over 15% of female combatants developed severe PTSD symptoms during the conflict, although at the time, these symptoms were misunderstood or entirely ignored. Amidst all this brutality, camaraderie among female combatants emerged as a crucial source of strength. In an environment devoid of respite, their relationships became an emotional refuge. They shared their experiences, supported each other, and cared for the weaker ones whenever circumstances allowed. Former combatant Anna Petrenko, in one of her memoirs, recalled how a stranger she shared a trench with became her sister on the front lines. She helped me survive each day. We cared for each other without needing many words, because deep down, we knew we only had each other. The cold, hunger, lack of hygiene, and emotional weight of the war did not break these women, although they left permanent scars on many. The harshness of the Eastern Front spared no one, but in the midst of the horror, these combatants displayed courage and resilience that continue to be remembered as a testament to their unyielding spirit of survival. The terror of the invasion, Soviet women combatants on the Third Reich's front line. The brutality faced by Soviet women combatants at the hands of the Third Reich unveils one of the most harrowing and least discussed aspects of World War II. As the Red Army fought to halt the Nazi advance, these women not only confronted the horrors of combat, but also deliberate and cruel violence when captured. For the Nazis, these women posed a dual threat, as active soldiers challenging their war machine and as ideological adversaries defying the rigid gender norms upheld by Hitler's regime. The Nazi view of women as domestic, submissive figures utterly detached from combat clashed violently with the reality of Soviet female fighters. This ideological dissonance fueled a visceral hatred toward them, reflected in the speeches of Nazi officers, who referred to Red Army women as communist beasts or aberrations of nature. Such ideological disdain served as justification for the extreme violence inflicted upon these women on the Eastern Chechen Front. Most captured women stood no chance of survival. Summary execution orders were common, especially as the war progressed and Nazi brutality intensified. To German soldiers, a woman wielding a rifle mocked their vision of order and male dominance. Public executions, torture, and acts of humiliation became routine. The capture and execution of Zoya Kosmodemyanskaya in 1941 exemplified the savagery that would follow. Tortured and publicly hanged, her body was left as a warning to other partisans. Sexual violence was one of the most ruthless and systematic forms of abuse inflicted by the Nazis on Soviet women prisoners. Rape, both individual and gang assaults, was used not only as a form of personal humiliation, but also as a tool of psychological destruction. Many accounts describe how captured women endured repeated abuse over days, only to be executed afterward. Those who survived recounted profound despair and shame, knowing their suffering would not end with liberation, as they would face additional stigmas upon returning to their communities. Although precise figures are elusive, historians estimate that a significant proportion of captured women endured such violence before their execution. This pattern of abuse reveals how women's bodies became another battlefield, where the Nazis sought to obliterate not only their physical strength, but also their dignity and humanity. For prisoners not immediately executed, the fate awaiting them was equally horrific. Prisoner of war camps. In these camps, conditions were inhumane. Women received even less food than their male counterparts, were forced into grueling labor under extreme conditions, and lacked access to any form of medical care. Diseases such as dysentery, tuberculosis, and pneumonia spread rapidly, and many women perished slowly from starvation and illness. The testimony of Yelena Mazanik, a Soviet partisan captured in 1943, offers a harrowing glimpse into life in a Nazi camp. Mazanik described how she and other prisoners worked to the point of collapse under constant threats of physical punishment and execution. For many, suicide became the only possible escape. In her memoirs, Mazanik recalled witnessing fellow inmates throw themselves against electrified fences, seeking a quick death rather than enduring daily torture. In addition to physical abuse, psychological terror was systematically employed to break their spirits. Prisoners were forced to witness the executions of their comrades or kept in solitary confinement for days to crush their will. In other cases, women were paraded naked or subjected to degrading public displays as a form of symbolic humiliation before local populations. This level of violence aimed not only to punish Soviet women combatants, but also to send a message to the entire Red Army. Women who took up arms would be subjected to the utmost cruelty. Yet despite this terror, many women stood firm until the end. Accounts from prisoners liberated by the Red Army reveal that even in the darkest moments, some of these women defied their captors through acts of silent resistance, refusing to betray information or beg for their lives. The treatment of Soviet women combatants on the Eastern Front exposes the fusion of ideological hatred and systematic brutality that defined the Third Reich's policies. These women not only fought an enemy on the battlefield, but also endured a level of violence specifically designed to destroy them both physically and spiritually. Their often forgotten stories stand as a testament to the extreme sacrifices they faced and their unyielding resilience in the face of indescribable horror. Unleashed brutality, massacres and tortures on the battlefield. The unimaginable brutality unleashed on the Eastern Front reached its peak when Soviet women combatants fell into the hands of the Third Reich. To the Nazis, these women were not only a real military threat, but also an ideological challenge that defied their rigid gender roles. This combination of hatred and contempt fueled unchecked violence, including torture, public executions, and systematic humiliation. One of the most harrowing cases was that of Masha Bruskina, a partisan and nurse just 17 years old, captured in Minsk in 1941. Forced to parade with a sign accusing her of betraying the homeland, Masha was publicly hanged, becoming one of the first examples of the extreme violence Soviet women would suffer in the years to come. This grim precedent set the tone for 1943 and 1944, as the Red Army gained strength and Nazi hatred escalated, leading to a sharp rise in the execution and torture of female combatants. A particularly emblematic episode occurred on October 24, 1943, in the Cherkasy region of Ukraine. 16 Soviet snipers captured by the Wehrmacht were taken to the outskirts of a small village. After days of interrogation and torture, they were executed one by one and buried in mass graves. A German soldier present described the scene as one of the darkest days of the war, a chilling testimony to the violence inflicted upon captured women. Torture was not only a means of extracting information, but also a deliberate act of cruelty. Among the most common methods were constant beatings, burnings, and mutilations, leaving the prisoners in prolonged agony. In many cases, women were subjected to mock executions, where they were repeatedly hanged or suffocated without being killed, prolonging their physical and mental suffering. Despite this torment, many combatants displayed remarkable resilience, refusing to betray their comrades even under extreme pain. Some survivors managed to escape and recount the horrors they endured, providing crucial testimony to understand the scale of these crimes. Yekaterina Zelenko, a Soviet aviator captured in September 1943, was tortured with electric shocks and systematically abused for weeks. In her memoirs, Zelenko described how her captors saw Soviet women as inhuman, something to be punished for taking up arms like a man. Zelenko escaped, but many of her comrades were not as fortunate. Another heartbreaking account is that of Tatiana Baramsina, a sniper captured in July 1944. Baramsina was publicly tortured for hours, forced to dig her own grave before being executed with a gunshot to the head. Though she did not survive, her story was documented through subsequent Soviet investigations and became a symbol of the extreme sacrifice faced by combatants on the Eastern Front. Sexual violence was another of the most atrocious crimes suffered by captured women. While such violence is tragically common in armed conflicts, on the Eastern Front, it was used as a deliberate weapon of dehumanization. Many women were subjected to group assaults before being murdered, and the few available testimonies reveal the extent of the suffering inflicted by their captors. This violence sought not only to punish the combatants, but also to destroy their dignity and break their will. For those not immediately executed, their fate was equally inhumane. Captured women were sent to prisoner of war camps, where they faced harrowing living conditions. Camps for Soviet prisoners were notorious for their brutality, and for women, the situation was even worse. They received less food and medical care than men, and were forced into grueling labor under extreme exhaustion. Mortality rates in these camps were alarming, with many women dying slowly from hunger, disease, and constant violence. In Gomel, Belarus, in December 1943, Nazi brutality reached another level. 10 female partisans were publicly hanged in the town square, their bodies left on display for days. Local inhabitants were forced to walk past the executions, an act designed to instill terror among the population and quash any attempts at resistance. These public humiliations aimed not only to punish the combatants, but also to send a clear message: resistance would be crushed in the most brutal manner imaginable. The public display of bodies, systematic tortures, and abuses suffered by Soviet women combatants reveal the deep ideological hatred the Nazi regime harbored against them. To the Nazis, these women were not merely military enemies. They were symbols of an ideology and resistance that challenged the very foundations of their worldview. Yet rather than breaking them, many of these women faced brutality with extraordinary strength, becoming martyrs and symbols of the fight against oppression. Under fire. The partisan struggle against Nazism. The partisan struggle on the Eastern Front, was one of the most significant yet least recognized chapters of World War II, with Soviet women playing a key role in weakening Nazi forces through sabotage, espionage, and ambushes. Far from conventional battlefields, these combatants operated from the shadows, risking their lives in missions that demanded courage, ingenuity, and extraordinary physical and mental resilience. On November 5, 1943, a sabotage operation near Smolensk epitomized the importance of these clandestine warriors. A group of 30 female partisans led by Olga Fedosieva managed to destroy a critical railway used by Nazi forces to transport supplies. Fedosieva recounted in her diary how they walked for miles under the cover of night, carrying explosives in utter silence, broken only by their restrained breathing. A single mistake could mean death for all. These missions, known as railway hunts, were an effective tactic to destabilize the enemy's logistical infrastructure. Female partisans not only acted as saboteurs, but also as spies and field leaders. Maria Polivanova, for example, repeatedly infiltrated occupied territory disguised as a peasant to gather intelligence on German troop movements. Such information was crucial for planning ambushes or surprise attacks. Polivanova and many others proved that in a war of attrition, intelligence and mastery of the terrain were as lethal as any firearm. The bravery of these women also shone in direct combat operations. On November 11, 1943, Nina Onilova, a sniper-turned-partisan, led an attack on a German convoy, successfully destroying a fuel train. Her precision and knowledge of the local geography ensured flawless execution, demonstrating that partisans could match or even surpass their male counterparts in effectiveness. However, these victories came at a high cost. Women captured by Nazi troops faced horrific fates. The brutality of German reprisals was relentless. On November 8, 1943, a group of female partisans was ambushed during a mission to destroy a key bridge over the Desna River. After hours of combat, the survivors were captured and publicly executed, their bodies displayed in a nearby village square as a warning. Maria Semyonova, one of the few who escaped, described witnessing the fall of her comrades and the terror of being hunted in hostile territory where every shadow meant danger. They discovered us just as we were about to place the explosives. We tried to flee, but the forest was no longer our refuge. It was a death trap, she wrote in her memoirs. These reprisals sought not only to physically eliminate the partisans, but also to instill terror among the local population. The Nazis used public humiliation as a psychological weapon, displaying the bodies of captured and executed fighters to demoralize anyone considering joining the resistance. In December 1943, in Gomel, Belarus, 10 female partisans were hanged in the town square, a calculated act of brutality that forced civilians to witness the execution as an inescapable warning. Despite these atrocities, female partisans continued to defy the enemy and lead critical operations. On November 15, 1943, Vera Koruzhaya led an offensive against a German detachment in the forests of Belarus. Koruzhaya, a committed communist leader, organized her comrades to execute coordinated attacks that inflicted significant damage. However, after being captured, she was brutally tortured and executed. Her sacrifice became a symbol of the absolute commitment of Soviet women to the resistance. Female partisans faced not only the brutality of the enemy, but also social barriers and internal prejudices from their own comrades. Early in the war, their role was underestimated, and they were often seen as auxiliaries rather than full-fledged combatants. However, with each successful operation, their worth became undeniable. Olga Fedosieva, Maria Polivanova, Nina Onilova, and Vera Koruzhaya are just a few names in a long list of women who left an indelible mark on the fight against Nazism. By the end of 1943, more than 28,000 women had actively participated in the Soviet partisan resistance. These women, many of them young and with no prior combat experience, defied not only a brutal enemy, but also the gender expectations imposed by their society. Their courage and sacrifice not only weakened Nazi forces from within, but also inspired a generation of fighters to continue the struggle, proving that resistance knew no gender when the fate of a nation was at stake. Witnesses of sacrifice, medics and nurses on the brink of despair. The work of Soviet medics and nurses during World War II stands as one of the most heroic yet underappreciated feats of the conflict. Under extreme conditions, facing death daily and with scarce medical resources, these women not only saved thousands of lives, but also embodied the spirit of sacrifice and resilience that defined the Soviet people in their fight against Nazism. From the start of Operation Barbarossa in 1941, Soviet casualties skyrocketed, exceeding 700,000 within the first months. The military healthcare system buckled under the pressure, prompting the Soviet government to form the Combat Nurse Corps, where thousands of women were trained to provide medical care on the front lines. In these dire circumstances, nurses and medics were tasked with not only treating the wounded, but doing so amid enemy fire, often risking their own lives. One of the most emblematic figures of this sacrifice was Lyudmila Mikhailova, who served on the brutal front lines of Stalingrad. In her memoirs, Mikhailova described how constant bombardments forced nurses to improvise. "We treated the wounded in the middle of mud and blood. There was no time for fear. Every minute could mean the difference between life and death. Working under enemy fire and in temperatures plunging to -30 degrees Celsius was the norm for these women, who often physically carried wounded soldiers to improvised shelters. Conditions in field hospitals were equally inhumane. Frequently lacking basic medical supplies, they operated with minimal hygiene, increasing the risk of infections. During the Battle of Stalingrad, over 40,000 soldiers were treated in provisional hospitals, where female staff worked shifts of more than 12 hours, racing against time and despair. Valentina Sherbakova, a nurse renowned for her bravery, exemplified the unyielding commitment of these women. During a bombing raid, Sherbakova ran into a burning building to rescue a group of trapped soldiers. In an interview, she recalled, "I knew I could die, but when a soldier cried for help, there was no other choice. It was my duty to be there." Her story reflects the selfless dedication of these women, who prioritize saving others over their own safety. Medics also played a fundamental role, performing surgical operations under near-impossible conditions. One of the most notable surgeons was Yevdokia Zavali, who during the Battle of Kursk in 1943 performed over 300 surgeries in makeshift tents where sterility was non-existent. Zavali described how she had to act swiftly without adequate anesthesia or surgical tools. Every second counted. If you hesitated, another soldier would die. The pressure was unbearable, but there was no room for mistakes. Her dedication and efficiency earned her multiple valor decorations, though recognition came only after years of silent sacrifice. And nurses often involved making morally agonizing decisions. As the front lines shifted rapidly, they were sometimes forced to leave behind critically wounded soldiers, a decision that many carried as a lifelong burden. Others chose to stay, accepting the risk of being captured by the enemy, where torture and death often awaited them. Statistics reveal the magnitude of their sacrifice. Over 200,000 women served in the Soviet armed forces as medical personnel during the war. In addition to their roles in field hospitals, they also participated in mass evacuations of the wounded from the front to the rear, navigating through constant bombings and ambushes. At the war's end, many of these women were celebrated as heroines and continued their lives in the medical field. However, for many others, their service on the front lines faded into oblivion. The testimony in their memoirs and diaries, along with the decorations they received, serves as a poignant reminder of their indispensable role in defending the Red Army and the Soviet Union. Through the cold, chaos, and horror of war, these women displayed unparalleled strength, becoming true witnesses of sacrifice. The forgotten heroines, the tireless struggle for recognition after the war. The end of World War II in May 1945 brought a mixture of relief and devastation. The Soviet Union, emerging as one of the victorious nations, bore the weight of millions of lost lives and a nation in ruins. For the women who had fought on the front lines, victory did not mark the end of their battles. Upon returning home, these veterans faced a silent but equally grueling challenge, earning the recognition they deserved in a society that preferred to relegate them to obscurity. While men returning from the front were welcomed as heroes, women who had served as snipers, pilots, medics, and partisans encountered cold indifference. The Soviet government's official narrative glorified the male soldier as the pillar of victory, deliberately ignoring the contributions of women. Veterans, often bearing physical scars and psychological trauma, were pushed back into traditional roles as wives, mothers, and homemakers. The return to civilian life was particularly difficult for those who had been prisoners of war. Rather than being seen as victims of the conflict, many faced stigma and suspicion, as captivity was perceived as a mark of dishonor. The trauma of abuse and torture that many had endured at the hands of the Nazis remained unspoken, as discussing it was considered inappropriate or shameful. Thus, most of these women bore their pain in silence. The Soviet Women's Commission, established to address issues related to female veterans, focused its efforts on family welfare and reconstruction, but did little to shed light on the role of women combatants. Their stories became footnotes when, in reality, they had been the protagonists of countless heroic acts that helped secure victory. An example of this marginalization is Maria Vassilieva, a veteran and writer who dedicated her life to documenting the sacrifices of her comrades in her book, The Warriors of the Motherland. Despite compiling accounts of hundreds of women who served valiantly, her book was ignored by Soviet publishers. The official narrative had no room for women in combat, perpetuating their invisibility. The stigma and lack of recognition exacerbated the post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, that many women suffered after the war, a condition we now understand well was not recognized at the time, and many veterans struggled with haunting memories, constant nightmares, and feelings of alienation. As Yevdokia Zavali, a surgeon who worked under the most extreme conditions, put it, "They needed us during the war, but when it ended, they made us feel as though we had never existed." It was not until the 1960s, with de-Stalinization and the opening of archives, that some historians and activists began to recover the voices of these women. Exhibitions, interviews, and publications slowly emerged, shedding light on the critical role they had played. During the International Women's Year in 1975, events held in the Soviet Union recognized, for the first time in decades, the contributions of women during the war. For many veterans, however, this recognition came too late. Some had already passed away, while others lived in poverty, relegated to an unjust oblivion. Nevertheless, those who survived continued to fight to have their stories told. Support groups formed by female veterans became spaces where they could share their experiences, remember their fallen comrades, and above all, preserve the memory of their sacrifices. The legacy of these women has gained renewed relevance in recent decades. Their stories are now the subject of historical studies and have been incorporated into textbooks, inspiring new generations. Recognizing their role not only honors their sacrifices, but also underscores the importance of gender equality in times of crisis. Reflecting on the struggle of these forgotten heroines reminds us that history is incomplete until all voices are heard. The women who fought, saved lives, and resisted valiantly in humanity's darkest moments deserve to be remembered for what they truly were, fundamental pillars of the Soviet victory in World War II.